Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit der regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 Uhr wird jetzt zurückgeschossen.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg? Wollen Sie, wenn nötig, totale und radikale, als Sie uns heute überhaupt erst vorstellen können?
The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them.
Early 1945 in Courland on the Baltic Sea. For several months, Army Group North of the Wehrmacht had been surrounded on the peninsula by the Red Army. The immense losses of men and material over the past years of the war had shattered the once feared army of Nazi Germany. Amateur photographs captured the sorry state of the trapped units. Nazi propaganda, on the other hand, still clung to the myth of military strength. The newsreel shows the commissioning of so-called Volksgrenadiere in the homeland.
Diese Waffen werden Ihnen heute zu treuen Händen übergeben. Die Heimat schaffte Ihnen in schwerer Arbeit auf unter Frontnahmebedingungen. So gehen Sie mit Freude und Eifer an Ihren Dienst, immer Ihre Pflichten vor Augen, damit Sie am Kampfe die Erhaltung des Reiches die besten Grenadiere des Führers sind.
Volkssturm men, youths, and stragglers formed the personnel of the newly formed units. What was particularly perfidious, even in a hopeless military situation, the men swore an oath to the Führer.
The idea was not to give up, and the concept of self-sacrifice was a very strong and important one. That's why Hitler thought the War Navy was so great, because they went down with man and mouse. He thought that was great. That was the way to do it.
On January 12, 1945, the Red Army launched a major offensive into East Prussia. At 4:45, the sky suddenly turned bright as day as up to 300 Soviet guns per kilometer of front opened fire on the German positions. Red Army cameramen filmed apocalyptic scenes behind the Wehrmacht's defensive lines along a broad front after it quickly collapsed. In previous years, the Wehrmacht had waged a campaign of extermination in the Soviet Union against the racially inferior population. This was according to the ideology of the National Socialists. Now the theater of war had shifted east to the territory of the German Reich, and with the Red Army soldiers came fear of revenge in many places.
People were simply afraid. They were told that the subhumans of the Red Army were coming. They also knew what sort of atrocities had been committed before in the Soviet Union. So it was a mixture of prejudices and a real fear of Red Army brutality. And people recognized what crimes Nazi Germany had committed, and they knew people would want to take revenge.
In view of these prospects, many of the approximately 2.5 million people who lived in East Prussia at the time wanted to leave their homeland as quickly as possible and flee to the west. But there was a problem.
The Nazis forbade escape for a long time. They wanted the positions to be held, and thus to be able to counter the Red Army, which contributed to the fact that the escape then took place so abruptly. People left at the last minute with makeshift luggage and were often wiped out in the course of the war. Who was fleeing on these journeys? Mothers with children and old men, which meant, as always in war, it hit the weakest, who had to fend for themselves and who were held responsible for the failure of an entire nation, as well as a lack of evacuation plans.
Because the land route to the west was largely cut off by the Soviets, many people fled across the frozen lake. But further dangers lay in these coastal waters. The provisional destination for many was the Baltic Sea coast near Gdansk. People hoped to continue their escape from there by ship because the ports in the region were still under German control. Gotenhafen was one of them. It was there, on the 30th of January 1945, that thousands of people boarded the Wilhelm Gustloff. The ship had previously enjoyed nationwide fame. Adolf Hitler had personally traveled to Hamburg in May of 1937 for its launching.
Ich taufe dich auf den Namen Wilhelm Gustloff.
For years, the ship had served as a cruise ship for the Nazi organization. Kraft durch Freude, strength through joy. Party comrades relaxed on its decks during cruises through the Mediterranean and North Sea. Now, the ship was supposed to help bring refugees and soldiers to the west. It was overloaded with thousands of people on board when it set sail. Because of the heavy weight, the captain selected a course through deep water. This led the ship far out into the Baltic Sea, where the Soviet Navy also cruised. At around 9 p.m., the ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was named after a leader of the National Socialist Party who was murdered in 1936, was discovered and torpedoed by a Soviet submarine. It sank in the icy waters. At least 9,300 people died in the disaster.
It wasn't a war crime in legal terms because the Gustloff was sailing dark in hostile seas, was armed, and there were soldiers on board. So in a way, according to the laws of war, it was legal to attack the Gustloff. Whether it was legitimate is another question, and everybody has to answer that question for themselves.
On the other side of the world, too, the war raged on unabated. U.S. naval units were cruising off the Japanese island of Iwo Jima, about 1,000 kilometers south of Tokyo. In mid-February of 1945, battleships opened fire on the island, which is only 21 square kilometers in size, but was strategically important. U.S. bombers took off from the Mariana Islands and provided air support for the operation.
The volcanic island of Iwo Jima was an important location because there were airfields and because it was useful as an emergency landing site for bombers, so it became a strategic asset. And that's why Iwo Jima came into focus.
Shortly before 9 o'clock in the morning, war correspondents from the U.S. Government Office of War Information filmed tens of thousands of U.S. Marines as they landed on the island 3 days after the attack began. This footage of the fierce fighting around the so-called Sulphur Island later formed the basis of the documentary film To the Shores of Iwo Jima.
We run into trouble on Green Beach. From their fortified positions on Mount Suribachi, the Japs look right down our throats.
In addition to the cameramen, there were also photographers among the war correspondents. A few days after the start of the landing operation, one of them captured U.S. Marines raising the U.S. flag on the summit of the extinct volcano, Mount Suribachi. Although it was only a reenactment of a previous raising of the Stars and Stripes, the photo has gone down in history.
World War II was a war of images, yes. Out of millions of photos, we have 5 or 6 photos that we all know. And the flag raising on Iwo Jima, the reenactment, symbolized the victory of the Americans in the Pacific.
But it would be several months before American victory in the Pacific was achieved. The fighting around Iwo Jima alone raged on for weeks after the photograph was taken on the volcano's summit. The Japanese defenders pursued bloody tactics.
The commander was fully aware that he wouldn't be able to defend the island. The goal was to inflict as many casualties on the Americans as possible, so that the war would become unpopular, and that the war would then be stopped. That didn't succeed. But nevertheless, the number of dead was immense.
More than 6,800 Marines died before the island was completely taken. Added to this, there were nearly 20,000 wounded. On the Japanese side, a large part of the approximately 20,000 defenders lost their lives. Only 216 surrendered to the enemy.
Overall, the Americans were very surprised by the Japanese willingness to make sacrifices, which were shown in the operations of the defense of Iwo Jima. No one actually believed that the Japanese would really fight so rigorously to the last man. And that played a very big part in the Americans changing their mind, because at some point they said, we're going to have to end the war differently.
Japanese troops were not just vehemently resisting the threat of defeat on Iwo Jima. Since October of 1944, their commanders in the Pacific had been using a new approach, kamikazes. Pilots swooped down on enemy warships in their planes, risking their own deaths. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, commander of the Japanese Naval Air Forces, had developed the idea.
That was, of course, a complete shock for the Americans. They hadn't expected it. It was a completely new form of warfare. They hadn't expected that willingness to make sacrifices.
The squadrons of suicide pilots had names like Morning Sun and Mountain Cherry Blossom. It was not difficult to recruit fanatical new blood for these suicide missions.
However, if you look at it in terms of results, it wasn't very efficient. A lot of planes were shot down by U.S. defenses. And even the ones that did get through had little effect. It was more of an element of shock.
Images like these contributed to this. This footage from January 21st, 1945 documented the aftermath of a kamikaze attack on the USS Ticonderoga near the Formosa Strait. Although the aircraft carrier was not sunk in the attack, more than 100 men aboard the ship were killed, further increasing the toll of American troops in the Pacific. Almost 2 weeks later, the Big Three of the anti-Hitler coalition met at the Soviet seaside resort of Yalta. For years, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States had been united against Nazi Germany. Now, the war in Europe seemed to be decided in their favor. Its end was just a matter of time. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, and U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt made plans for the future and fleshed out the agreements of a post-war order that they had agreed on at the Tehran summit about a year earlier.
The big three gathered at Yalta, and now the issue of the westward shift of Poland was decided, and it was clear that there would be occupation zones, and there was also discussions about what would happen in the Pacific.
So far, the Soviet Union had not taken part in the fighting against Japan. The U.S. president, who was in poor health, wanted to change this in order to end the war in the Pacific quickly and to avoid further heavy losses.
There, Roosevelt approached Stalin and negotiated with him and said, "We need you in the Pacific." And he got a promise from Stalin that the Red Army would attack in Europe 3 months after the end of the war, which they did to the day.
In return, the Western Allies pledged to further expand their support for the Red Army by bombing the German Reich. 2 days after the end of the summit, Dresden became the focus of their air force. Around 800 British Lancaster bombers took off on the 13th of February 1945 to attack the then 7th largest city in Germany, which had previously been largely spared from airstrikes.
In this situation, Churchill said, "Give me something to show Stalin that we support the Soviets." The idea then became, if we flew airstrikes to the rear of the Soviet front and cause chaos there, that would somehow help the Red Army.
The British planes reached Dresden shortly before 10:30 in the evening. An automatic camera shot footage from the air of how the explosive and incendiary bombs were dropped. The attack was not about hitting exact targets. The city was to be extensively destroyed. Within 15 minutes, 3/4 of the city center was in flames.
The fact that Dresden was such a devastating attack was also due to the circumstances. Dresden had no anti-aircraft defenses. The anti-aircraft guns had been moved to the eastern front, and some of the night fighters were not allowed to take off. It was a clear night, and the British were able to come in relatively low. So it was a textbook attack.
A few hours later, on Valentine's Day 1945, American bombers attacked Dresden again in daylight. A U.S. newsreel described the event.
The veteran 1st Division of the 8th Air Force today carried its 200,000 ton of bombs to help an ally. Now they hit Dresden hardest of all.
A total of 4 waves of attacks hit the important transport hub on the Elbe.
The Blitz here, blasting away for the Russians now 45 miles away, links the two-front Allied drive from east and west on Berlin.
The consequences of the Anglo-American airstrikes were devastating. It was estimated that up to 25,000 people fell victim to the bombs. "I never believed," said an official at the Dresden Missing Persons Center who described his impressions, "that death could approach people in such different forms: burned, charred, dismembered, apparently sleeping peacefully, contorted in pain, completely cramped, clothed, naked, and as a pitiful heap of ashes, and above it all, the acrid smoke and the unbearable smell of decay." Images taken months after the attacks gave an idea of the scale of the disaster. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the Wehrmacht was falling further into a defensive mode. In the fall of the previous year, the Allies had liberated Aachen, the first major German city. In December of 1944, a surprising German offensive in the Ardennes initially led to a slowdown of the Anglo-American advance. Only after the complete defeat of the German counterattack in January 1945 could U.S. forces fully concentrate on the advance eastward again. They encountered fierce resistance at Jülich, A German newsreel reports.
Bei Jülich gehen deutsche Eingreifreserven zum Gegenstoß über. Wo der Gegner angreift, stößt er auf den verbissenen Widerstand unserer Grenadiere und Fallschirmjäger.
The German defenders had blown up the Ruhr Dam. As a result, the level of the river at Jülich had also risen noticeably. Only after the floodwaters had receded were U.S. units able to cross the Ruhr and move into the city center on February 23rd. There, the GIs were greeted with a shocking picture. Jülich no longer existed. For months, the town had been under fire. Countless artillery shells and aerial bombs had landed on it. The last remaining inhabitants of Jülich had already been evacuated in December of the previous year. What remained was a field of ruins in which the German defenders barricaded themselves and engaged the Americans in a battle for mountains of rubble that was as fierce as it was futile. In early March, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. forces in Europe, Dwight D. Eisenhower, arrived in the conquered city and visited Jülich Citadel. For a long time, the structure had been considered impregnable. No enemy soldier had entered it since the Napoleonic Wars. Eisenhower's propaganda photographs from the citadel were intended to convey confidence and make it clear that there was no doubt that the entire German Reich would be conquered just like the centuries-old fortress. Meanwhile, in the east, the Red Army continued its advance unabated. In addition to East Prussia in the north, it also advanced further south in Silesia towards what was then the territory of the German Reich and advanced rapidly. The region was of great strategic importance because of its numerous industrial plants. "Our tanks have crushed everything," wrote a Red Army soldier in his diary on January 23rd. Their tracks flattened wagons, horses, and everything else that was on the road. The reasons for the success lay in the Red Army's numerical superiority in men and material, and in serious tactical errors on Hitler's part.
In November of 1943, Hitler focused his emphasis on the West. In 1944, it went all wrong. But he still had the feeling that he had to fight the West Allies who had pushed back the Germans from their new territories. And that at a time when the Red Army launched their greatest attack on the Neitzel River. By doing so, he made himself Stalin's best alliance partner.
In recent years, many Germans had fled from the bombing raids of the Western Allies to Silesia, which had long been spared the air war. With the advance of the Soviets, they now found themselves in the middle of the war. Similar to East Prussia, many people there had only one goal: to flee from the Red Army.
Die Rache wird fürchterlich sein, denn das, was wir
The revenge will be terrible.
des sogenannten Ostfeldzuges,
because what we did in the course of the Eastern Campaign, especially against Soviet civilians, what crimes we committed, that will come back to us as revenge.
das wird als Rache zu uns zurückkehren.
The fears often proved to be justified. Many Red Army soldiers then actually took revenge for the crimes that the Wehrmacht and SS had previously been guilty of.
Wir haben hier eine
What we had there was an escalation of violence against German civilians through the shooting of civilians and of women and children,
durch das Erschießen von Frauen und Kindern, die Verschleppung
the abduction of German civilians,
von deutschen Zivilisten und
and the mass rape of women.
von Frauen.
Die sexuelle Gewalt an deutschen Frauen erklärt sich aus
The
verschiedenen
sexual violence against German women can be explained in several ways.
gesagt, dass der Körper der Frau symbolisch für die Nation steht.
First, it is said that a woman's body is symbolic of the nation. Thus, a desecration of the woman stands for a desecration and dishonor of the enemy.
Bedeutet damit auch gleichzeitig eine Schändung oder Entehrung der gesamten Nation.
Nazi propaganda regularly picked up on these desecrations and thus continued to stir up fear and hatred among the population. A newsreel report from January 1945 from Silesia.
In diesen von deutschen Truppen wiedereroberten Orten ist jedes Haus von den Grausamkeiten bolschewistischer Soldateska gezeichnet. Die Bestialitäten sind zu ungeheuerlich, als dass alles gezeigt werden könnte, was die Kamera festhielt. Qualvolles Entsetzen steht noch in den Gesichtern dieser deutschen Frauen. Sie berichten von den Tagen namenlosen Grauens, in denen sie wehrlos den verzierten Horden ausgeliefert waren. In unersättlicher Gier durchsuchte und beraubte die sowjetische Soldateska die Wohnungen.
Despite the militarily hopeless situation, leading National Socialists continued to say that capitulation was a no-go. Instead, they continued to cling to strategically outdated concepts to stop the Red Army.
The question for the Germans was, how can we stop this avalanche of a Red Army? And one concept that was developed as early as 1944 on the Eastern Front was to introduce fixed sites that were then later declared fortresses, which were located at traffic junctions, and that you defended these points, and so you had breakwaters on which the waves of the Red Army attack breaks.
One of these breakwaters was to be Breslau in Lower Silesia, which was declared a fortress by Hitler.
Der ununterbrochene Ansturm des bolschewistischen Gegners auf die Festung Breslau scheitert immer wieder an dem eisernen Abwehrwillen ihrer Verteidiger. Der Führer Niederschlesiens, Gauleiter Hanke, der die Besatzung und die Bevölkerung Breslaus mit einem fanatischen Widerstandsgeist beseelt hat. Männer und Frauen greifen mit zu, um die Stadt ständig verteidigungsbereit zu halten.
On January 20th, Karl Hanke, the Gauleiter of Lower Silesia, ordered the civilian population to leave the city. However, due to a lack of organization and fear of the dangers of fleeing, 200,000 people stayed in Breslau. The militarily inexperienced population was to defend the city together with units of Volkssturm, Wehrmacht, and SS. Those who refused were shot.
This
led to absurd measures. They created taxiways in the city. They tried to defend the city in house-to-house fighting, which drove up the death toll among the civilian population to an exorbitant degree.
While Breslau was still under siege, the Red Army advanced to the Oder on other sections of the front. Some 370 kilometers downstream, it had built bridgeheads on the west bank near Küstrin. Nevertheless, the Nazi leadership remained unimpressed. In the middle of the month, Goebbels wrote in his diary, "As far as the East is concerned, the Führer is no longer too concerned. He has the impression that we are slowly regaining solid fronts." An idiosyncratic reading of events which was picked up by war correspondents. A bizarre interview took place on the Oder. Even though it was never shown in the cinemas, it illustrated the absurdity of Nazi propaganda.
Na Kameraden, ihr habt euch ja hier eine prima Villa gebaut, oder?
Das brauchen wir da, das ist ein Ding.
Wo sind Sie denn zu Hause?
Ich aus Berlin-Charlottenburg.
Berlin-Charlottenburg, ja? Weiß denn Ihre Frau, dass Sie hier sind?
Na, im Augenblick ist sie noch sehr im Zweifel.
Ja?
Ja, die ist jetzt weggekommen. Jetzt in Lübeck, bei Lübeck muss ungefähr liegen.
Na, wollen wir sehen, dass Sie die auch noch hier sehen?
Ja, hoffentlich sieht sie mich hier.
Bist du wohl nicht? Der eine ist noch ganz in Ordnung. Und sonst, der Russe lässt euch hier in Ruhe, was?
Ach, am einmal geht's. Der zittert mehr wie wir.
While the Red Army had conquered large parts of Silesia and Pomerania in the east, the Americans, British, and Canadians had made rather slow progress in the west. Their next major objective was the Rhine. U.S. forces had been fighting their way towards Cologne since the end of February.
So the Rhine was now the big natural border in the west. That's why the fighting on the way to the Rhine was still relatively heavy, with relatively heavy losses. February 45 was one of the most deadly months for the U.S. Army.
On March 5th, American units reached the suburbs of the cathedral city. The 3rd U.S. Armored Division moved in through the districts of Bocklemünd and Vogelsang. The ordinary citizen of Cologne has nothing to fear from Allied troops, read leaflets that had previously been dropped over the city. A day later, the GIs fought their way into the city center and witnessed a young woman who was apparently caught between the lines in her vehicle on Christophstrasse. Though seriously injured, she could be saved. A few hundred meters away, the Americans encountered a last German pocket of resistance near Domplatz. A Panther tank blocked the way to the Rhine, but even it couldn't stop the offensive for long. With one well-aimed hit, it was taken out. Only 3 of the 5-man crew could save themselves from the burning wreck. The last significant resistance had been broken. Late in the afternoon on March 6th, peace returned. In the districts of Cologne on the left bank of the Rhine, the Second World War was over. The next day, the High Command of the Wehrmacht reported succinctly, "The heap of rubble that is Cologne has been left to the enemy." The U.S. military, on the other hand, reported extensively from the conquered city.
Cologne was one of the great German cities, by far the largest city conquered by the Allies up to that time. Hamburg, Leipzig, Berlin, Munich were still far away, so it made sense to conquer Cologne. The Cologne Cathedral was a landmark in the west of the Reich. So you document this more widely than the conquest of Wesel. As part of the Special Film Project 186, Army Air Force cameramen accompanied the advancing U.S. troops. In Cologne, they captured the immense extent of destruction on 16mm color film. To this day, their images provide a depressing testimony of the city, almost 3/4 of which had been destroyed. U.S. leadership placed great value on the work of the cameramen. Film had already played a big role in World War II as documentation, but also as propaganda. Camera technology was portable and practical, and eventually also in color, shot in color by the Americans. And they wanted to bring the images home with them. They wanted to document not just for the cinemas, but also for the military internally. Before the defeat, the defenders of Cologne had successfully blown up the bridges over the Rhine. Thus, for the time being, the Allies were denied a way across the river. A day after capturing Cologne, the Americans pulled off another coup some 55 kilometers upstream. A small advance party of the 9th U.S. Armored Division reached Ludendorff Bridge, which spans the Rhine near Remagen. To their surprise, the bridge had not been blown up, and there was also little or no resistance from enemy troops. The Remagen Volkssturm didn't assemble. If the Remagen Volkssturm battalion had been there, had fired a few more rounds, then this small patrol, there weren't that many American soldiers, wouldn't have been able to reach the bridgehead so easily. The bridge was successfully captured in a surprise attack. The action was reenacted for propaganda purposes a few days later. Thus, during the next 24 hours, more than 8,000 U.S. soldiers reached the eastern bank of the Rhine. Wehrmacht units tried to correct their mistake and destroy the bridge by airstrikes and artillery fire. However, it took 10 days for the bridge to actually collapse. By then, U.S. sappers had erected a pontoon bridge and continued to move units across the Rhine on a large scale. It was a severe blow to the defense of the Reich, which was not without consequences for those responsible. Hitler was absolutely furious, and the bridge commander was executed right away. And all the others they could find, they were tried and murdered, I'd say. The Führer no longer appeared in public. On the 20th of March, he allowed himself to be filmed one last time in the garden of his Reich Chancellery. Did Hitler realize that the war was lost, and if so, when did he realize it? One argument was that Hitler was not stupid and knew how things were going. This led to him withdrawing and showing himself only when he could announce a victory. Well, these announcements of victory failed to materialize, and he became more and more depressed. Physical decline set in because it was clear to him how this was going to end.
Here, the Führer awarded Hitler youth who had distinguished themselves militarily. The fact that the war was lost does not change the sense of duty to continue fighting. The younger generation in particular fell victim to the inhuman fanaticism.
In this last phase of the war, the kids were the last reserve of the Third Reich, very individually as cannon fodder. All of these children were used as cannon fodder for the final battle.
Ich war bei unserem ersten Angriff als Befehl des Bandführers als Melder eingesetzt. Ich musste eine sehr wichtige Meldung zu den Sturmgeschützen zurückbringen und diese heranziehen. Diese kamen dann auch nach und so ermöglichten sie uns das Eindringen in das vom Feind besetzte Dorf und so hoben wir die Bereitstellung auf.
Als der Russe näher an Lauban heranrückte, habe ich mich dem Kampfkommandanten von Lauban freiwillig als Melder zur Verfügung gestellt. Meine Aufgabe bestand darin, Meldungen zu den einzelnen Kompaniegefechtsständen zu bringen. Außerdem habe ich oftmals Panzerfäuste und Verpflegung in die Hauptkampflinie geschafft.
The boy with the bazookas was Wilhelm Hübner. At the time, he was the subject of numerous newsreel reports.
16-jährige Hitlerjunge Wilhelm Hübner hat sich bei der Zurückeroberung von Lauban als Melder in den Reihen der Grenadiere hervorragend bewährt. Er erhielt vor wenigen Stunden das Eiserne Kreuz.
The Lower Silesian city of Lauban in present-day Poland had already been largely captured by the Red Army in February of 1945. In early March, however, it was recaptured by the Wehrmacht, one of the extremely rare German success stories of those days. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels immediately traveled to the region and shortly afterward gave a fanatical speech in nearby Görlitz. It was his last appearance in a newsreel.
Jene Divisionen, die jetzt schon zu kleinen Offensiven angetreten sind und in den nächsten Wochen und Monaten zu Großoffensiven antreten werden, werden in diesen Kampf hineingehen wie in einen Gottesdienst. Und wenn sie ihre Gewehre schultern und ihre Panzerfahrzeuge besteigen, dann haben sie nur ihre erschlagenen Kinder und geschändeten Frauen vor Augen und ein Schrei der Rache wird aus ihren Kehlen emporsteigen, vor dem der Feind erblassen wird.
Goebbels, in particular, if you will, comes into his own with his speech in the spring of 1945. It is, of course, also a staging of the downfall, and the emphasis is that we will not survive it. That's it, actually. There's always talk of the turning point and of victory. But the underlying motif is actually it's Nazi ideology or nothing.
NS-Ideologie oder nichts.
In January 1945, Goebbels called for a people's sacrifice for the Wehrmacht and Volkssturm. As in the Napoleonic Wars in the previous century, the population had to donate.
Grenadiere und Volkssturmmänner brauchen Bekleidung und Ausrüstung. Das Volksopfer wird sie ihnen geben. Was Schränke und Schubladen an nicht unbedingt nötigen bergen, bringt es in die Sammelstellen. Es ist für unsere Soldaten und Volkssturmmänner und damit für euch.
In the face of impending doom, the regime desperately tried to compensate for the losses, including with women.
Panzerfaustschießen in einer deutschen Stadt. Hier kann jeder Deutsche die Handhabung dieses vom Feind gefürchteten Panzernahbekämpfungsmittels kennenlernen. Es ist genauso einfach, wie es aussieht.
The brutal thing, of course, was the distance of these bazookas, which was a maximum of 100 meters, usually 50, 60, in order to be really effective. Those who fired them, of course, always paid with their lives. Of course, that was also the cynical calculation of the regime. A Volkssturm man who then carried it out, who destroyed an enemy tank. It was the choreography of doom.
The territory still under German control was shrinking day by day. According to the will of the Nazi leadership, people had to now sacrifice not only clothes and iron, but also themselves.
This was an indication of the regime's lack of inhibition and brute willingness to die, which in the end was ready to open all the floodgates, to discard any form of responsibility and to do everything possible to continue this war, no matter how futile it had become, to the last bullet.
On March 19th, 1945, U.S. B-29 superfortresses were loaded with bombs on Saipan, the main island of the Marianas. The target of the long-range planes was the Japanese capital. Mission commander, Major General Curtis E. LeMay, had previously made a major decision. As part of Operation Meeting House 2, Tokyo was to be attacked not only with explosive bombs, but also with incendiary bombs. These were also to be dropped over residential areas. An armada of bombers took off from 3 island airfields on the afternoon of March 9th. Each of the more than 300 planes was loaded with 40 cluster bombs, each containing 1,500 napalm bombs. The GIs called them Tokyo calling cards. Original footage of the large-scale night attack is not available. Scenes shot later showed the superfortresses dropping their deadly load. More than 1,600 tons of bombs were dropped from a low altitude over the urban area. Japanese houses were mostly made of wood and paper and immediately burst into flames. Strong westerly winds ignited a firestorm. Up to 100,000 people were reported to have died in the operation. Over 40 square kilometers of the city was destroyed. The attack is still considered the heaviest conventional airstrike in history.
The intent was to convey the message to the Japanese opponents of the war that Japanese war propaganda had very strongly stirred up the will on the part of the Japanese soldiers to really go to their deaths.
The fanaticism with which the Japanese military fought was once again evident on Okinawa. The largest island in the Ryukyu chain is located about 500 kilometers off the southern main island of Nippon. The U.S. military had assembled 180,000 troops for an invasion of Okinawa. When the enterprise launched on Easter Sunday, 1945, the GIs initially encountered little resistance. The defenders had retreated into the hinterland, where they put up fierce resistance.
When you think about the Battle of Okinawa, a lot of civilians there were holed up in caves, and Japanese Americans were deployed here to deliver the message in Japanese: come out of the caves, surrender. It doesn't make sense for you to kill yourselves or to wait to die by flamethrowers or by hand grenades.
But not everyone was willing to give up. For example, teachers would throw themselves and their students to their deaths from cliffs on the island to escape life under U.S. occupation. It would take months before Okinawa could be brought completely under American control. On April 12, 1945, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt died at the age of 63. In a funeral procession through the streets of Washington, Americans bid farewell to their head of state. Vice President Harry S. Truman became his successor. In Berlin, the news caused a furor. Here you have the miracle I always predicted, Hitler is said to have shouted when he heard of Roosevelt's death. Now who's right? The war is not lost.